He was just a ghost in tattered clothes, another homeless man most people would ignore. The young man with the expensive watch saw him as nothing more than a stain on his perfect day. He opened his mouth to mock him, to put him in his place, not knowing the ghost in front of him was the only reason he, or his entire family legacy, even existed. One name was all it took to bring a rich man's world crashing down around him. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The automatic doors of the grocery store slid open with a gentle whoosh, a sound that seemed to welcome everyone into its brightly lit sanctuary of abundance. For Henry Walker, however, it felt less like a welcome and more like a breach of enemy lines. At 60 years old, Henry moved with the kind of deliberate, careful precision that comes from a life of discipline and pain. His gait was stiff, a permanent echo of old injuries that ached with a dull, persistent rhythm, a living souvenir from a past he rarely spoke of. His face was a roadmap of hardship, etched with deep lines that told stories of sleepless nights and unforgiving suns, yet his eyes, clear and observant, held a quiet intelligence that missed nothing. They were the eyes of a man who had learned to see the world for what it was, not what it pretended to be. He wore military surplus, a faded green jacket and cargo pants that had been washed so many times they were soft and thin, clean but frayed at the cuffs and seams. He was a relic, a ghost of a forgotten war, haunting the fluorescent-lit aisles of modern convenience. Inside, the store was an assault on his senses. The air hummed with the drone of refrigeration units and the cheerful, vapid pop music that trickled from unseen speakers. It was a symphony of forced happiness that felt alien to him. The lights were too bright, a sterile, shadowless glare that seemed to expose every worn thread on his jacket, every line on his face, and the food. The sheer, overwhelming abundance of it all was a spectacle of casual plenty that bordered on the obscene. Towers of gleaming apples, mountains of bread in crackling plastic, endless rows of colorful boxes promising satisfaction. He clutched a few crumpled bills in his hand, a small, precious treasure he had carefully guarded. It was just enough for a can of soup, maybe two if he chose the generic brand, and perhaps a small loaf of day-old bread from the discount rack. His mission was simple, a small objective in a long and quiet war for survival, and his primary strategy was to remain invisible. He kept his head down, his shoulders slightly hunched, a posture of deference he had perfected over years of navigating a world that had no place for him. There was a bitter irony, he often thought, in having survived the chaos and violence of a foreign war, only to find himself fighting a different, more insidious battle on the streets of the very country he had sworn to protect. This was a war of attrition, fought not with rifles and grenades, but with hunger, cold, and the crushing weight of invisibility. As Henry navigated the polished linoleum of the soup aisle, another man, a world away in spirit, was striding through the same space with an air of absolute ownership. Leo Vance was in his late 20s, a portrait of unearned, casual arrogance. He was dressed in clothes that cost more than Henry's entire monthly budget for the past year, a tailored jacket over a crisp shirt, designer jeans, and shoes that looked like they had never touched a dusty pavement. He held a top-of-the-line smartphone to his ear, his voice loud and laced with an exasperated impatience that demanded to be heard by everyone in the vicinity. "No, you don't understand. It's a complete catastrophe," he barked into the phone, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous aisle. "If it drops another 2 points, my Aspen trip is basically ruined. I don't pay you to tell me about market fluctuations. I pay you to make them work for me. Just fix it." He gestured with his free hand, a flash of a gold watch at his wrist, a heavy, ostentatious piece of machinery that told time but spoke only of wealth. He was a prince in his kingdom, and the world was his to command. Henry ignored him, his focus narrowed to the task at hand. He scanned the bottom shelf, where the store's own brand of soup was stacked in neat, unassuming pyramids. The labels were plain, the prices low. He spotted a can of chicken noodle, a small comfort, a taste of something warm and familiar. He bent down slowly, his knees protesting with a series of dull clicks, his back sending a sharp signal of complaint. As he reached for the can, the worn sleeve of his jacket rode up his forearm, revealing a patch of weathered skin and the faded ink of a military tattoo. It was a simple design, an eagle with its wings spread, a symbol of a life he had lived long ago, a brotherhood he had belonged to. It was a part of him he could never wash away, no matter how frayed his clothes became. At that exact moment, Leo ended his call, snapping his phone shut with a frustrated sigh. He turned abruptly, not looking where he was going, his mind still tangled in the disastrous fate of his stock portfolio. He nearly collided with the stooped figure of the old man, stumbling back a step as if he had just avoided contact with something unclean. A look of pure, unadulterated disgust twisted his handsome features. He wrinkled his nose, his eyes sweeping over Henry's worn attire with a contemptuous glare. "Watch where you're going, old man," Leo sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. He made a show of brushing off his jacket sleeve, as if Henry's very proximity had soiled it. "You might want to use some of that change you beg for to buy some new clothes. You're a public eyesore." The words, sharp and cruel, sliced through the mundane hum of the grocery store. A profound silence fell over the aisle. A woman pushing a cart a few feet away froze, her hand hovering over a box of crackers. A young cashier at the end of the lane stopped scanning items, her eyes wide. The cheerful pop music suddenly seemed jarring and inappropriate. The air grew thick, heavy with the unspoken judgment of strangers, the collective discomfort of a public shaming. Henry felt the stares, the sudden, focused attention of everyone around him. He had tried so hard to be invisible, and now he was the center of a spectacle. Yet, no anger rose in him. There was no fire, no righteous indignation. There was only a deep, profound weariness, a sadness that settled in his bones like the winter cold. He had heard words like these before, had felt the sting of such casual cruelty more times than he could count. It was just another skirmish in his long, quiet war. Slowly, painfully, he straightened his back, each vertebra seeming to protest the movement. He left the can of soup on the shelf and turned to face the young man. He looked at Leo, truly looked at him, and saw not a monster, but a boy playing at being a man, a boy wrapped in layers of privilege so thick he couldn't see the world beyond them. Henry's voice, when it came, was not loud. It was quiet, raspy from disuse, but it cut through the thick silence with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. It carried the weight of years, the authority of a man who had seen too much to be intimidated by a spoiled child. "Your father taught you better manners than that," Henry said, his gaze steady and unwavering. The words were simple, a plain statement of fact. He paused, letting the statement settle in the charged air before he delivered the final, devastating blow. "He was a good man, a brave man. Captain Vance would be ashamed to hear you talk like that." The name, Captain Vance, hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. It was an impossible connection, a key that unlocked a door no one knew was there. The effect on Leo was instantaneous and absolute. His smug, arrogant expression did not just falter. It shattered. It dissolved as if it were made of sand, washed away by a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated shock. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly white. His mouth fell open slightly, his jaw slack. He stared at Henry, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, terrifying confusion. The name, his father's name, spoken by this ghost in tattered clothes, was a discordant note in the symphony of his well-ordered life, a piece of a puzzle that simply did not fit. The world, for a moment, stopped spinning. The grocery store, the silent shoppers, the hum of the lights, it all faded into a distant blur. There was only the old man's steady gaze and the impossible, echoing name that connected two worlds that should never have collided. Leo stammered, the sound foreign and clumsy in his own ears. How do you know that name?" The question was a desperate whisper, a plea for an explanation that could somehow restore the natural order of his world. The shoppers who had frozen in place began to move again, their hushed murmurs a low hum that filled the void of the initial shock. They cast furtive glances, their curiosity piqued by the sudden, inexplicable drama that had erupted between the rich man and the vagrant. A man in a crisp red vest with a name tag that read, "Mr. Henderson Manager," began to walk towards them, his expression a careful mixture of concern and practiced authority. His job was to maintain the store's pleasant, sterile atmosphere, and this raw, uncomfortable confrontation was a stain on the polished floor. Henry saw the manager approaching and knew what was coming. He had been through this drill before. He was the disruption, the piece that didn't fit, the problem to be removed. He wanted no part of the escalating scene. The name had been a reflex, a ghost of a memory jolted loose by the young man's arrogance. But now he regretted it. He had exposed a nerve, and all he wanted was to retreat back into the shadows of his anonymity. Without another word, he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of concession, and turned to walk away. He left the can of soup on the shelf, his small mission for a warm meal forgotten. Survival, at that moment, meant escape. Wait. Leo's voice was sharp, cracking with a desperation that startled even him. He snapped out of his stupor, his mind racing to process the impossible. He abandoned his shopping cart, its contents representing hundreds of dollars of gourmet food and expensive wine, and rushed after the retreating figure. The cart rolled a few feet and bumped softly into a display of imported olives. Leo didn't notice. He pushed through the automatic doors, the cool air of the parking lot a slap against his heated skin. "Please stop," he called out, his voice echoing slightly in the wide open space. Henry kept walking, his pace steady, his gaze fixed on the grey expanse of asphalt ahead. The parking lot was a stark contrast to the store's bright interior. Here, the sky was an overcast sheet of white, and the air smelled of exhaust fumes and damp pavement. It was a lonely, transient space, a place Henry understood far better than the world of abundance he had just left. "It doesn't matter," Henry called back over his shoulder, his voice low and gravelly. "Just a ghost. Forget you saw me." But Leo couldn't forget. He ran to catch up, his expensive shoes scuffing on the gritty surface. He reached out and grabbed Henry's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "You can't just say that and walk away," he pleaded, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "Who are you?" He looked into the old man's eyes, searching for an answer. "My father," Leo said, his voice dropping, becoming vulnerable for the first time. "He died when I was a kid. He was a hero. Everyone said so, but nobody ever told me the details. They just gave me a folded flag and stories about his bravery. Please." The desperation in his voice was raw, a genuine plea from a son who had grown up in the shadow of a myth, a man he knew only through photographs and second-hand praise. The touch, the desperate grip on his arm, was the trigger. The pressure of Leo's fingers on the thin fabric of his jacket was like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for over 30 years. The grey, mundane reality of the parking lot fractured, the sound of a distant car horn dissolving into a high-pitched whine. The world tilted, and Henry was no longer standing on cold asphalt but falling, tumbling back through time. The smell of exhaust was replaced by the thick, choking scent of cordite and hot dust. The overcast sky bleached into a merciless white-hot disk hanging in a hazy, pale blue expanse. The roar of a helicopter's rotors thundered in his ears, a rhythmic, deafening beat that vibrated deep in his chest, accompanied by the incessant, frantic crackle of radio static. He was young again, a sergeant, his body lean and hard, coiled with the nervous energy of a man deep in enemy territory. The sun beat down on his helmet, and sweat traced salty paths through the grime on his face. He was part of a small reconnaissance squad, moving through a landscape of dry, cracked earth and sparse, thorny vegetation that offered little cover. The tension was a living thing, a knot in his gut that tightened with every snapped twig, every rustle of wind. He glanced over at his commanding officer, a young, determined Captain Vance. The captain was a good leader, the kind of man who earned respect not through his rank but through his actions. He was fair, he was calm under pressure, and he never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. But even then, Henry could see the weight of command in the lines around the captain's eyes, the immense burden of holding the lives of a dozen men in his hands. The ambush was not a gradual escalation, it was an explosion of violence. One moment, there was the tense quiet of the patrol. The next, the world erupted in a cacophony of death. An explosion to their left sent a shower of dirt and shrapnel into the air, the concussion wave hitting them like a physical blow. Automatic gunfire opened up from 3 directions at once, the air filled with the lethal zip and crack of bullets passing inches from their heads. The squad was pinned down instantly, their training kicking in as they dove for whatever meager cover they could find. Men were yelling, the radio was screaming, and the air was thick with the metallic taste of fear. Then Henry heard a cry that cut through the chaos, a sharp, guttural sound of pain. He looked over and saw Captain Vance on the ground, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, a dark, wet stain spreading rapidly across the fabric of his fatigues. He was exposed, caught in a crossfire, trying to drag himself behind a small rocky outcropping. The enemy, seeing an officer down, was concentrating their fire on his position. Bullets kicking up dust all around him. The order came crackling over the radio, a frantic voice yelling for them to fall back, to pull back to a more defensible position and consolidate. It was the logical order, the textbook maneuver. To stay would be suicide, but Henry ignored it. He saw his captain, the man who shared his own rations when supplies were low, the man who wrote letters home to his wife and young son every single night without fail, lying wounded and alone. In that moment, his mind was a maelstrom of pure adrenaline, years of training, and a fierce, unyielding loyalty. He wasn't thinking about heroism. He wasn't thinking about medals or glory. He was thinking about the promise they all made to each other, the unspoken creed of their brotherhood: you do not leave a man behind, ever. "Cover me!" he screamed, and without waiting for a response, he began to lay down a barrage of suppressing fire, his rifle bucking against his shoulder. He crawled from his position, his body low to the ground, the dirt and chaos a blur around him. Bullets whizzed past his head, so close he could feel their heat. He kept moving, his elbows and knees raw, his focus narrowed to a single point, the wounded man just yards away. He reached the captain, who was grimacing in pain but still trying to return fire with his sidearm. "I've got you, sir," Henry grunted, grabbing the captain under the arms. He dragged him, inch by agonizing inch, back towards the relative safety of a shallow ditch. The captain's body was a dead weight, and every movement was a monumental effort. Once they were in the ditch, Henry worked fast, his hands moving with a practiced efficiency born of countless drills. He pulled a tourniquet from his pack and cinched it high and tight on the captain's thigh, twisting the rod until the bleeding slowed to a trickle. All the while, he kept firing, switching between his rifle and calling for a medevac on the radio, his voice a calm, steady presence in the storm of noise and pain and grit. He saved his captain's life, not with a grand, heroic gesture, but with a series of small, determined actions, fueled by a loyalty that defied orders and logic. The memory faded, the roar of the helicopter's blades slowly dissolving back into the gentle hum of traffic in the parking lot. Henry was standing there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding against his ribs as if he had just run a mile. The ghost of the past was in his eyes, a haunted, distant look that saw not a parking lot, but a dusty, blood-soaked battlefield. Leo was still holding his arm, but his grip had loosened. He was staring at Henry, his mouth slightly agape. In the space of a few silent, breathless seconds, his perception of the man before him had been completely and irrevocably transformed. He was no longer looking at a homeless man, a public eyesore, a ghost in tattered clothes. He was looking at a soldier. Leo, shaken by the raw, haunted look in Henry's eyes, softened his entire demeanor. The arrogance that was his second skin had been flayed away, leaving behind something uncertain and fragile. He let go of Henry's arm as if the frayed fabric had suddenly burned him. He did not demand, he asked, his voice stripped of its usual confidence. "Look, I'm sorry," he began, the words feeling inadequate, flimsy. "What I said in there it was unforgivable. I know that. But you knew my father. You knew him. I have to understand how. Please, just let me buy you breakfast at that diner over there." He pointed a slightly trembling finger towards a low building across the street with a cheerful neon sign that glowed even in the daylight. "No strings attached. I need to hear." Henry was wary. His life on the streets had been a masterclass in the art of deciphering empty promises and hidden motives. Kindness was a currency he rarely encountered, and when he did, it almost always came with a price he could not afford to pay. He was used to being let down, to being seen as a problem or an opportunity, but never just as a man. He studied Leo's face, searching for the trick, the angle, but he saw none. What he saw was a genuine, desperate confusion, the look of a boy whose entire world had been tilted on its axis. That, combined with the gnawing emptiness in his stomach and the simple, profound appeal of a hot meal, made him hesitate. The promise of coffee, of eggs and bacon, of sitting in a warm place for an hour, was a powerful lure. After a long, tense silence that stretched between them in the gray air of the parking lot, Henry gave a slow, reluctant nod. The diner was a classic, worn-down American place, a time capsule of cracked red vinyl and chrome that had lost its shine. The air inside was warm and thick with the comforting smells of coffee, frying bacon, and griddled onions. A low murmur of conversation from the other patrons, the clatter of cutlery on ceramic plates, and the sizzle from the kitchen created a gentle, unassuming soundtrack. It was a neutral ground, a world away from the sterile judgment of the grocery store and the violent chaos of Henry's memories. A waitress with a tired but kind smile showed them to a booth by the window. The vinyl on the seat was split in several places, leaking yellowed foam, and the Formica tabletop was scarred with the faint rings of 1,000 coffee cups. They sat opposite each other, the width of the table a vast canyon between them. Henry slid in close to the window, creating as much physical distance as possible, a silent declaration that he was there for the meal, not for friendship. Leo, fumbling with the plastic-coated menu he didn't even read, flagged the waitress down. "He'll have the Grand Slam breakfast," he said, his voice still a little shaky. "And a coffee, black, and I'll just have a coffee too." Henry didn't object. He watched as the waitress scribbled on her pad and left, his hands resting on the table, his long, calloused fingers still. When the coffee arrived, he wrapped his hands around the warm, thick ceramic mug, letting the heat seep into his cold skin. He said nothing, waiting. The food arrived on a heavy platter, a mountain of pancakes, scrambled eggs, glistening bacon, and sausage links. It was more food than Henry had seen in one place for himself in years. He picked up his fork and began to eat, not with the frantic hunger of a starving man, but with a slow, deliberate pace that spoke of a deeply ingrained dignity. Each bite was a small victory, a moment of quiet, profound satisfaction. Leo watched him for a few moments, sipping his own coffee, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Finally, he leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "So, you served with him?" he asked, the question tentative. "What was he like? Really like? All I have are the photos, you know, and the stories my mom and his friends from before the war told me. They all said he was a hero, but that's just a word." Henry finished chewing a piece of bacon, took a slow sip of his coffee, and then looked at Leo. He seemed to be weighing his words, deciding what to share and what to keep locked away. "A hero," Henry repeated, his voice a low rumble. He wouldn't have called himself that. He was just a man doing his job. Slowly, hesitantly at first, and then with a steadier voice, Henry began to talk. He didn't just recount the ambush. He painted a fuller, more vibrant picture of the man Leo had only known as a static image in a frame. He spoke of Captain Vance's habit of sharing his own rations with any soldier who was running low, never making a show of it, just quietly leaving a chocolate bar or a can of peaches by their pack. He described the captain's terrible jokes, puns mostly, that were so bad they made the men groan, but they also broke the tension in moments when it was thick enough to choke on. He told Leo how his father, every single night, no matter how exhausted he was or how dangerous their position, would sit down with a small, worn notepad and a pen and write a letter home. "He never missed a night," Henry said, his eyes focused on a point somewhere in the distant past. He'd always say, "Got to check in with the command staff," and he'd tap his heart. "He meant your mother, and you." Leo listened, his coffee forgotten, his world shrinking to the space inside that worn-down booth. For the first time in his life, his father was becoming more than a two-dimensional hero, more than a name on a plaque or a face in a dress uniform. He was a real person, a man who told bad jokes and shared his food and loved his family with a fierce, quiet devotion. Leo imagined his father, a young man in a foreign land surrounded by death and fear, carefully writing letters to a wife he missed and a son he was desperate to see grow up. The guilt was a physical weight in his chest, a cold, heavy stone. He saw the stark, shameful contrast between the honorable man Henry was describing, a man who led with compassion and quiet strength, and the spoiled, arrogant person he himself had become, a person who yelled at people over money and mocked a man for his poverty. The man Henry was describing would have been disgusted by him. "After he was hit, the medevac took him out," Henry continued, his voice pulling Leo from his spiral of shame. "They flew him to a field hospital and then back to the States, I heard. Our unit was redeployed to a different sector a few days later. I never saw him again." He paused, a shadow passing over his features. "I got my own ticket home a few months after that. A piece of shrapnel in the leg. They sent me back, patched me up, and gave me my discharge papers." He shrugged, a simple, tired gesture that encompassed a world of pain and loss. That was that. He took another bite of his eggs, the silence returning to the booth. Leo was struggling to process it all, the story of the rescue, the image of his father's quiet integrity, the sheer dumb luck of his own existence. He owed his life, his house, his stocks, his stupid, expensive Aspen trip, everything, to the quiet, dignified man sitting across from him, a man he had called an eyesore not an hour ago. The shame was so intense it was nauseating. Henry looked up from his plate, his gaze meeting Leo's. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a deep, abiding weariness. "He was a good man, your father," Henry said softly, as if to close the conversation. "He talked about you all the time. My boy, Leo," he'd say. "He had this whole plan." Henry's voice was gentle, but the words landed on Leo like hammer blows. "He couldn't wait to get home to teach you how to fish. He had it all mapped out, the lake he was going to take you to, the kind of rod he was going to buy you for your birthday. He was so excited about it." This small, personal detail, this forgotten promise from a ghost, was the thing that finally broke him, the fishing trip. His mother had told him about it once, years ago, a story about a promise his father had made in one of his last letters, a promise he never got to keep. It was a symbol of all the lost moments, all the years stolen from them, the carefully constructed dam of Leo's composure, already cracked and weakened, shattered completely. A sob caught in his throat, thick and painful. Tears, hot and shameful, welled up in his eyes, blurring the image of the old soldier across from him. He tried to speak, to say something, anything, but no words would come. Overwhelmed by a profound, unexpected grief for the father he never knew and a tidal wave of shame for the man he had become, he finally broke down. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking, and wept. Leo's sobs were quiet, choked things, the sound of a dam breaking after a lifetime of pressure. He kept his face buried in his hands, his expensive watch glinting under the diner's fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to the raw, unfiltered grief that racked his body. Henry sat perfectly still, his fork resting on his plate, the remains of his breakfast forgotten. He did not offer comfort, he did not speak. He simply waited, a silent, stoic witness to the unraveling of a young man's world. The waitress hovered nearby, her expression a mixture of pity and alarm, before Leo, sensing her presence, made a small, dismissive gesture with his hand, waving her away without looking up. After a few long, heavy minutes, the shaking of Leo's shoulders subsided. He slowly lowered his hands, his face pale and blotchy, his eyes red-rimmed and raw. The mask of arrogant indifference was gone, replaced by a look of profound and devastating shame. He looked across the table at Henry, at the old soldier who had seen him at his absolute worst, and then saved him from his own ignorance. The guilt was a living fire in his gut, but as he looked at the man his father owed his life to, the fire began to transform, hardening from shame into a powerful, unyielding resolve. A sense of duty, clear and sharp as a bayonet, pierced through the fog of his self-pity. "You saved his life," Leo said, his voice hoarse and raspy. "He came home. He got to see my mother again. He lived because of you." He shook his head, a look of self-loathing twisting his features. "And I treated you like you were nothing, like dirt on my shoe." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick black leather wallet. He opened it and, without counting, pulled out every bill it contained, a thick wad of 50s and 100s that he pushed across the scarred tabletop. "I have to make this right," he insisted, his voice gaining strength. "You can't live like this, not on the streets. I won't allow it. Here, take this. It's not enough. I know it's not nearly enough. But it's a start. Please." Henry looked down at the pile of money, then slowly raised his eyes to meet Leo's. The weary softness that had been in his gaze just moments before was gone, replaced by a hard, flinty glint. His back straightened, and the quiet dignity he carried like a shield became an impenetrable wall. "I'm not a charity case," he said, his voice low and firm, each word landing with deliberate weight. "I don't take handouts." The refusal was so immediate, so absolute, that it stunned Leo into silence. He had assumed this was the answer. This was how his world worked. You identified a problem, and you threw money at it until it was solved. He stared at the cash lying between them, a meaningless pile of paper, and then at the unyielding pride etched into every line of Henry's weathered face. It was a fierce, stubborn pride, the kind of pride that could keep a man whole when his life was in pieces, the only thing left when everything else had been stripped away. And in that moment, Leo understood his mistake with a clarity that was both humbling and deeply shameful. He was still trying to buy his way out of his guilt, to settle a debt of honor with a vulgar transaction. He was still treating Henry like a problem to be managed, not a man to be respected. He saw, with a sudden, painful jolt of insight, that dignity was a currency that could not be printed or spent. It could only be earned and offered. His cheeks flushed with a fresh wave of humiliation. Slowly, he reached out and gathered the bills, folding the money and pushing it back into his wallet with clumsy fingers. "Okay," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You're right. I'm sorry." He took a deep, shaky breath, forcing himself to think, to truly consider what Henry might need, not just what Leo wanted to give. An idea began to form, a different kind of offer, one that was not about money, but about history, about a debt that was not his to pay, but his to honor. "Not a handout," he repeated, looking up, his eyes filled with a new, desperate earnestness. "A place to stay." Henry raised a skeptical eyebrow. "My house," Leo pressed on, leaning forward. "It was my father's house, the one he came home to after you saved him. It's huge, and I live there all by myself. It's just empty space, echoing." He saw the flicker of distrust in Henry's eyes and hurried to explain. "There's a guest suite in the back of the house. It has its own entrance, its own bathroom, a small kitchen, everything. It's completely separate. You wouldn't even have to see me if you didn't want to." He paused, searching for the right words, the words that would bridge the chasm of pride and distrust between them. "It's not charity, Henry. It's what he would have wanted. A soldier who served with him, the man who saved his life, staying under his roof. That feels right, doesn't it? Please, don't think of it as me giving you something. Consider it a debt being repaid. His debt to you." The offer hung in the air, completely unexpected. Henry was taken aback, his defenses momentarily breached by the sheer sincerity in Leo's voice. This was different. This was personal, not transactional. It was an offer rooted in the shared, violent history that bound them together. The idea of staying in Captain Vance's house was both deeply unsettling and strangely, powerfully compelling. It felt like stepping into a ghost story where he himself was one of the ghosts. He was torn, every instinct for self-reliance. The solitary pride that had been his only armor for so many years screamed at him to refuse, to get up and walk away from this boy and his complicated guilt. But the exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness from a war that never ended, was a powerful tide pulling him in the other direction. The simple, profound promise of a real bed, a locked door, a safe place to rest, even for a single night, was a siren song he wasn't sure he had the strength to resist. He looked out the diner window at the grey, indifferent street, at the people hurrying by, none of whom saw him. After a long, heavy silence that seemed to absorb all the noise in the diner, he turned back to Leo. "I'll see the place," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "That's all I'll promise." The drive was a silent, awkward affair. Leo's car was a sleek, black machine, a luxury sedan that hummed with a quiet power, its plush leather interior insulating them from the noise and grit of the city. They pulled off the main road and into a wealthy, tree-lined neighborhood, the houses growing larger and more opulent with every turn. Finally, they turned into a long, curving driveway that led to a house that looked less like a home and more like a modern art museum. It was a structure of sharp angles, vast walls of glass, and stark white stone, beautiful in a cold, uninviting way. It didn't seem like the kind of house the Captain Vance Henry remembered would have chosen. As Henry stepped out of the car, a profound sense of dislocation washed over him. He felt like a crow that had landed in a cage of polished steel. Leo led him through a massive front door into an entryway that was more like a gallery lobby. The floors were polished concrete. The furniture was minimalist and uncomfortable looking, and the vast white walls were hung with enormous, abstract paintings that seemed to shout their own importance. The house was a monument to wealth, but it was a cold, sterile monument. It was clear that Leo did not live here. He simply occupied the space, a ghost of a different kind, haunting the halls of his own inheritance. Then Henry saw it. Tucked away on a smaller wall off the main living area, almost like an afterthought, was a collection of framed photographs. A shrine. He walked towards it, his worn boots making no sound on the polished floor. His heart gave a painful thud. There was Captain Vance, impossibly young and handsome, smiling confidently in his crisp dress uniform. There was another, a candid shot of the captain holding a tiny, swaddled baby, looking down at the infant's face with an expression of such pure, unadulterated love that it took Henry's breath away. That had to be Leo. And there, a formal family portrait. The captain with his arm around a beautiful, smiling woman, a young boy with a toothy, mischievous grin standing proudly in front of them. Seeing the photos was like a physical blow. The man he knew as a soldier, as a leader, was also this man, a husband, a father. He saw the family that Captain Vance had fought so desperately to get back to, the life he had been so determined to live. The weight of that day in the dust and chaos, the memory of blood and fear, pressed down on him again, but this time it was mingled with something else, a strange and unexpected sense of closure. He had done his job. He had sent him home to this. "This way!" Leo's voice was soft, pulling Henry from his reverie. He led him down a long, sunlit hallway, the glass walls looking out onto a pristine, emerald-green lawn. He opened a door at the end of the hall, revealing the guest suite. It was not a room, it was a small, self-contained apartment. A spacious bedroom with a large, neatly made bed, a cozy living area with a plush-looking sofa and a television, a small, modern kitchenette, and a bathroom that looked like it belonged in a five-star hotel. He walked slowly to the wall of glass at the far end. which looked out over the manicured lawn and a sparkling blue swimming pool. He saw his own faint reflection in the pristine glass. A tired old man in worn-out clothes, a ghost in a palace. This was a massive step, a surrender of the solitary pride that had been his only real possession for so long, but the exhaustion was a powerful, relentless tide. He turned from the window to face Leo. "Just for a few nights," he said, his voice quiet but firm, establishing his own terms. "Until I figure things out." A wave of relief so potent it almost made Leo dizzy washed over him. "Of course," he said quickly, his voice filled with gratitude. "Stay as long as you need. The place is yours." For the first time in a long, long time, maybe ever, Leo felt a flicker of genuine purpose, a sense that he was doing something real, something that mattered more than stock prices or vacation plans. He left Henry to settle in, closing the door softly behind him. He walked back to his vast, empty living room and picked up his phone. He didn't call his broker. He scrolled through his contacts until he found a name he hadn't thought of in years. A man his father had served with long ago. Someone who now held a senior position at the Department of Veterans Affairs. He pressed the call button, his heart pounding with a new kind of nervous energy. He was ready to start a new fight, a different kind of battle, this time for Henry. The first few days were a study in awkward, silent choreography. The vast, sterile house became a stage for two men who did not know how to move around each other. Henry kept to his suite, a space so clean and luxurious it felt like a hotel he could never afford. He made his bed with military precision the moment he rose, cleaned the bathroom sink after every use, and washed his single coffee cup immediately, leaving no trace of his presence. He was a ghost in a guest wing, determined to be as unobtrusive as a shadow. Leo, for his part, tried to bridge the gap, but his attempts were clumsy and stilted. He would knock on Henry's door to ask if he needed anything, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet hallway, and Henry would politely decline, his quiet dignity a gentle but firm rebuff. Their worlds operated on different clocks, their routines a stark testament to their disparate lives. Leo would wake late, long after the sun had filled the house with its cold white light. He would sip expensive coffee from a complicated machine and spend his days staring at the shifting green and red numbers on his laptop screen, a world of abstract wealth that felt increasingly hollow. Henry, however, was up at dawn, his internal clock still set to a military rhythm that 30 years of civilian life had not managed to erase. The quiet stillness of the early morning was his sanctuary. He found the manicured garden, a space Leo's hired landscapers kept tidy but soulless, and began to tend to it. He found a pair of old gardening gloves in the garage and started with a patch of rose bushes that were being choked by weeds. His hands, though stiff, moved with a gentle, knowing touch. He pulled the weeds, pruned the dead branches, and loosened the soil around their roots. There was a simple, honest logic to the work that soothed him. Plants, unlike people, were straightforward. They needed care, and if you gave it to them, they grew. They did not judge, they did not pity. They simply responded to a gentle hand. Leo made a point of having dinner with Henry every evening. At first, Henry was reluctant, but Leo insisted, framing it not as a command but as a personal request. He started cooking, simple meals at first, then more elaborate ones. The process of following a recipe, a welcome distraction from the complexities of his new reality. They ate at a massive dining table designed to seat 12, their two figures looking small and isolated in the grand, echoing room. It was during these quiet meals that Henry's story finally began to emerge, not in a flood, but in small, carefully chosen pieces, like stones being pulled one by one from a collapsed well. He spoke of his life after the army, the shrapnel in his leg leaving him with a permanent, grinding pain that made holding a steady job in construction or manual labor impossible. He tried office work, but the quiet, enclosed spaces felt like a trap, and the sudden noises of a ringing phone or a dropped file could send his heart into a frantic, panicked rhythm, a phantom echo of incoming fire. He spoke of his wife, a kind, gentle woman named Sarah, who had understood the parts of him that were broken without him ever having to explain them. She had been his anchor, his peace, and then she got sick. He didn't dwell on the details, but the pain in his voice was a raw, open wound. The illness was long, and the medical bills were a relentless tide that washed away their small savings, then their house, then everything they had built together. After she was gone, he was adrift. He had no children, no family left to turn to. He described the slow, humiliating slide into homelessness, a process so gradual he barely noticed it was happening until it was too late. It was a story without a single, clear villain, a quiet tragedy of a system that had no safety nets for a man who had fallen through the cracks. Leo listened, his fork still, his food growing cold on his plate. His understanding of the world, a world he had always believed was a meritocracy where success was earned and poverty was a personal failing, was being completely and irrevocably rewritten. He saw poverty not as a lack of character, but as a cascade of crushing misfortune, a series of wrong turns and bad luck that could happen to anyone, even a man who was by every definition a hero. A cold, unfamiliar anger began to smolder in his chest, an anger at the injustice of it all, at a country that would praise a man for his sacrifice and then abandon him when he needed it most. His own wealth, his own unearned privilege, suddenly felt like a disgusting, shameful burden. The turning point came on a bright Saturday afternoon. Leo was in his home office, on another frustrating, circular call with a bureaucrat at the Veterans Affairs office, when he heard the sound of unfamiliar voices echoing from the living room. He ended the call and walked out to find his friends, Mark and Jessica, helping themselves to drinks from his bar. They were a couple he had known since college, a pair who perfectly embodied the shallow, materialistic world he had once so comfortably inhabited. They were loud, impeccably dressed, and radiated an aura of effortless entitlement. "There you are," Mark said, swirling the ice in his glass. "We were in the neighborhood and thought we'd pop in. Your man Jeeves let us in." He smirked, a casual joke that wasn't really a joke. Before Leo could respond, Jessica, who was looking out the massive glass wall towards the garden, pointed. "Oh, Leo, you finally hired a gardener? About time." This place was starting to look a little rough around the edges. Leo followed her gaze and saw Henry on his knees, carefully tending to the rose bushes, his back to the house. A muscle in Leo's jaw tightened. He felt a flash of the old familiar arrogance, the instinct to impress, to belong. He could have laughed it off, made a joke, and moved on. But then he thought of the man Henry described. The captain who shared his rations. The father who wrote letters home every night. He thought of the debt that could never be repaid with money. He turned to his friends, his expression cold and unreadable. "He's not the gardener," Leo said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. The jovial atmosphere in the room evaporated. "His name is Henry Walker. He was a friend of my father's, and he is my guest." Mark and Jessica stared at him, their smiles frozen on their faces. The words hung in the air, drawing a line they had not known was there. They looked from Leo's hard expression to the old man in worn clothes in the garden and back again, their minds struggling to compute this new, uncomfortable information. The rest of their visit was a study in awkwardness. The easy banter was gone, replaced by stilted conversation and long silences. They left less than 20 minutes later, making flimsy excuses about another engagement. As Leo closed the door behind them, he knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating, that he had made a choice. He had severed a tie to his old, shallow life, and he felt no regret. From the garden, Henry had heard it all. The sound carried clearly through the open glass doors. He had heard the snide comment, and he had heard Leo's swift, unequivocal defense. He stopped his work, his hands still in the cool earth, and a strange, unfamiliar feeling washed over him. For years, he had been invisible, a ghost that people looked through, or an object of pity or contempt. But in that moment, someone had seen him, had stood up for him, had given him a name and a place of honor. It was the first time in longer than he could remember that someone had fought a battle for him. A crack, fine as a spider's thread, appeared in the thick stone wall he had built around his heart. He looked at the house, at the young man standing just inside the glass, and for the first time he began to believe that the offer was not about easing guilt, it was about respect. In the days that followed, a subtle shift occurred. Henry was still quiet, still kept mostly to himself, but the rigid distance he maintained began to soften. He started to take on small projects around the house, not as a servant, but as a man who knew how to fix things. He noticed a persistent drip from the faucet in the main kitchen, a sound Leo had tuned out months ago, and with a few tools he found in the garage, he fixed it in under 10 minutes. The silence that followed was more peaceful than Leo could have imagined. One afternoon, Henry ventured deeper into the garage, a space that was less a place for cars and more a museum of Captain Vance's forgotten life. It was filled with old tools, dusty workbenches, and half-finished woodworking projects. It was a testament to a man who had loved to build and create with his hands. Tucked away in a corner, under a dusty canvas tarp, Henry found a collection of fishing gear. There were several rods, a tackle box filled with lures and hooks, and a pair of old, cracked waders. It was all high-quality equipment, but it was clear it hadn't been touched in decades. The fishing lines were brittle, the reels were stiff with old grease. He spent the next several afternoons in the garage, methodically cleaning and repairing the equipment. He disassembled the reels, cleaning each tiny gear with solvent and applying fresh oil, his fingers moving with a gentle, practiced care. He stripped the old rotted line from the spools and carefully wound on new line that Leo had picked up for him from a sporting goods store. He was bringing the tools of a forgotten promise back to life. Late one afternoon, Leo found him in the garage, the setting sun casting long shadows through the open door. Henry was holding one of the rods, sighting down its length to check its straightness. He turned as Leo approached and held it out. This was his favorite, Henry said, his voice soft. A good flexible rod for trout. He gestured to the reel, which now gleamed, its handle turning with a smooth, silent motion. Your father always wanted to take you fishing. He looked at Leo, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his mouth. This rod needs a new line, but the reel is still good. Leo looked at the fishing rod, then at the old soldier holding it, and a profound sense of gratitude washed over him. Henry was not just a guest, not just a project to be solved. He was a bridge to a past Leo had never known, a living connection to the father he had only ever seen in photographs. In that moment, watching Henry's calloused hands so carefully restore his father's old passion, Leo felt a real, tangible link to both men. Henry was not just fixing a broken reel, he was mending a broken connection, bringing the memory of the house's former owner and the love he had for his son back into the light. Leo had declared war on the Department of Veterans Affairs. For weeks, it was a grueling battle of attrition fought not in trenches, but in endless phone queues, with unreturned emails and mountains of bureaucratic paperwork. He learned a new language, one of case numbers, file extensions, and obscure departmental codes. He was met with indifference, with polite but firm rejections, and with the soul-crushing inertia of a system designed to wear people down. But for every dead end, Leo's resolve hardened. The anger he had felt in the diner had been forged into a weapon of sheer, relentless persistence. He used his resources, not just his money to hire a paralegal to navigate the system, but his connections, calling in favors from people he had not spoken to in years, leveraging the Vance family name in a way he never had before, not for profit, but for justice. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday afternoon. It was not a dramatic announcement, but a quiet, unexpected phone call from a senior administrator, the very man he had been trying to reach for a month. The man's voice was tired but respectful. He explained that after Leo's persistent inquiries, he had personally pulled Sergeant Henry Walker's file. He spoke of a system that was overwhelmed, of files that were lost, of a tragedy of errors. And then he delivered the news. Henry's case had been reviewed, expedited, and approved. All of it. His full disability pension, retroactive to the date of his initial, mishandled claim over a decade ago. His back pay, a substantial sum that had been sitting in a government account, unclaimed, and full eligibility for a Veterans Housing Assistance Program. The total amount was staggering, a figure that would not just provide comfort, but restore a life. It was enough for Henry to live with security and dignity for the rest of his days. When the call ended, Leo sat in his sterile home office, the silence of the house pressing in on him. He looked at the stock portfolio on his screen, a series of numbers that had once defined his world, and felt nothing. The victory he had just won, the number the administrator had quoted over the phone, felt more real, more substantial than any market gain. He had done something. He had moved an immovable object. He pushed back from his desk and went to find Henry. He found him in the garage, the place that had become Henry's sanctuary. The air smelled of sawdust and old oil. Henry was standing at a workbench, holding one of Captain Vance's old woodworking tools, a beautifully crafted hand plane. He was running his thumb over the smooth, worn wood of the handle, his expression distant and contemplative, as if the tool itself held memories. "Henry," Leo said, his voice slightly breathless. Henry looked up, his eyes slowly coming back from the past. "I have some news," Leo continued, a wide, irrepressible grin spreading across his face. "We did it. I just got off the phone with the VA." He walked closer, his excitement making him pace a small circle on the concrete floor. "They approved everything, Henry. The back pay, the pension, the housing vouchers, all of it. It's all there. You're going to be okay." Henry looked at the young man, at his shining eyes and triumphant smile. He looked down at the hand plane he was holding, a tool that had been used to shape and build things of lasting value. He felt the weight of it in his hand, the solid, reassuring presence of it. He had been fighting for so long, a quiet, solitary war against hunger and cold and invisibility. He had grown so accustomed to the fight that he had forgotten what peace felt like. Now, in a single moment, the war was over. He did not react with a shout of joy or a sudden burst of emotion. Instead, a profound, quiet relief washed over him, so immense and so powerful it felt like a physical weight being lifted from his soul. A single tear, hot and unexpected, escaped his eye and traced a clean path through the fine layer of sawdust on his weathered cheek. He looked back at Leo, at the son of the man he had pulled from the dust, and saw not a boy, but a man who had fought a different kind of battle for him. "No, Leo," Henry said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "You were the one. You did it." The scene shifted. A few weeks later, under a sky the color of pale cornflowers, two men stood in a place of profound and ordered silence. The military cemetery stretched out before them, a vast, green lawn punctuated by rows of uniform white headstones that marched in perfect, silent formation towards the horizon. The air was still, the only sounds the distant whisper of the wind in the tall oak trees and the solemn call of a lone bird. It was a place of peace, a place of memory, a place where all wars were finally over. Henry was no longer a ghost. He stood tall, his shoulders back, his dignity not just restored but radiating from him like a quiet strength. He wore a simple, dark gray suit, new and well-fitting, a uniform of a different kind, one that spoke not of poverty or neglect, but of respect. He was a man who had come to pay his respects, and he looked the part. Leo stood beside him, a silent partner in this final, solemn mission. He watched Henry, who seemed to have shed 30 years of hardship along with his tattered clothes. He looked at the name carved into the pristine white marble of the headstone before them, Robert Vance, Captain, U.S. Army. Below it, the dates of his birth and his death, a short, stark summary of a life given in service. Henry reached into the inner pocket of his new suit jacket and pulled out a small, worn object. It was a photograph, yellowed with age and encased in a thick, cloudy layer of laminate, its edges softened and rounded from years of being carried in a wallet. He held it for a moment, his thumb stroking the surface. Before he knelt down, his movements still stiff but no longer pained, he carefully placed the photograph at the base of the headstone, propping it up against the cold marble. Leo leaned closer to see. It was a picture of two young men, their faces bright with the unshakable confidence of youth. They stood in the harsh sunlight of a foreign land, their arms thrown around each other's shoulders, their smiles wide and genuine. One was a young Sergeant Henry Walker, the other a young Captain Vance. They were brothers, forged in the crucible of combat, their bond captured in a single, fleeting moment of peace, just days before the ambush that would change everything. Henry remained kneeling for a long moment, his head bowed. When he spoke, his voice was a quiet murmur, meant only for the man buried beneath the grass. "We finally made it home, Captain." The words, simple and profound, struck Leo with the force of a physical blow. He understood, with a sudden, heart-wrenching clarity, that Henry was not just talking about himself being saved from the streets. He was talking about the promise he had made to his friend all those years ago, a promise to see him home, a mission that had taken over 30 years to finally complete. He was closing a circle, reporting back to his commanding officer one last time. Leo felt his own eyes burn with tears, but these were not the tears of shame he had shed in the diner. These were tears of gratitude, of awe, of a love for a father he was only just getting to know through the eyes of the man who had saved him. He reached out and placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. It was not a gesture of pity, not the condescending touch of a rich man helping the poor. It was a gesture of solidarity, of shared loss, of family. As Henry rose to his feet, Leo looked from his father's name on the stone to the smiling faces in the old photograph, to the quiet, dignified man standing beside him. In that moment, he realized he had more of a family now than he ever did when he was just a lonely, rich kid rattling around in an empty mansion. He had set out to save Henry, to repay a debt of honor and assuage his own crushing guilt. But the truth was, Henry had saved him by giving him a connection to his father, by showing him what true honor and integrity looked like, by giving him a purpose beyond the accumulation of wealth. Henry had pulled him from the wreckage of his own shallow life. He had found his own true hero, not in a faded photograph, but standing right next to him. They stood in silence for a while longer, two men sharing a moment that transcended words. Then, together, they turned and began to walk away from the grave, their footsteps soft on the perfectly manicured grass. They walked side by side, their shoulders almost touching, a comfortable, easy rhythm to their steps. They were no longer two separate entities from two different worlds, but a single unit, moving forward on the same path. The afternoon sun cast their long shadows before them, merging them into one. So, what now? Leo asked, his voice quiet, breaking the peaceful silence. You have your own place now. The papers are all signed. You have your own money. More than enough. It was a genuine question, one without expectation. Henry was a free man, his independence restored, his future his own to write. He could go anywhere, do anything. Henry continued walking, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the green lawn met the blue sky. A small, gentle smile touched his lips, a rare sight that lit up his weathered face. That fishing rod is ready, he said, his voice carrying a new lightness, a hint of joyful anticipation. And that boy your father wrote all those letters to, the one he could not wait to see, he still needs to learn how to cast a line properly. Leo stopped walking and looked at him, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across his own face. It was a genuine, heartfelt smile, one that reached his eyes and crinkled the corners. The weight of the Vance legacy, which had always felt like a burden of expectation, now felt like a gift, a story he was privileged to continue. The fishing trip was no longer a symbol of what was lost, but a promise of what was to come. The promise was finally being kept. The final image was of the two of them, one old, one young, a soldier and a son, walking together into the afternoon Sunday. They were not defined by the tragedy of the past or the shame of a confrontation in a grocery store aisle, but by the quiet, hopeful future they were now building together, one perfect cast at a time. Sometimes, the deepest wounds are not the ones you can see, and sometimes, a single act of redemption can heal two lives at once. A bully learned respect, and a forgotten hero was finally remembered. Their story is a reminder that everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about, and a little compassion can change the world.